we're going to talk about the basics, and we're also going to talk about how you can map some of those basics to common requirements. So fine-grained access control to do what? And that's where I would like to just sort of, as a parenthesis, talk about some data security requirements that we run into when we're talking to customers. So when we're talking to customers, sometimes they'll use different terminology. And one thing that they'll talk about will be masking or redaction. And I have grouped these together, even though they can be used in slightly different ways, given whether you're masking entirely data or you're just removing part of that data. But what I've noticed is that depending on the software vendor, the terms end up being used a little bit interchangeably. And at any rate, they're very close. And this is something that we can do in Denodo, as you may know, natively via the fine-grained security control. So it can either be static, of course, but usually, and of course when it's done with Denodo, it's dynamic. So the idea is it doesn't change how the data is actually stored, but it will change the data depending on who's accessing it and how it's visible. Now, tokenization is something else. Tokenization is a little bit more complex. Basically, you have a mapping between an original data value and a token. And that mapping needs to be done in both directions. So the idea is that only authorized profiles will be able to de-tokenize that data and map it back to the data as it originally was stored. But it can still be used in different ways, even in a tokenized format. Now, this is not something that Denodo can do by itself, but it's something that we do sometimes when we integrate with other outside software vendors. And there's a really interesting use case where they've used Protegrity combined with Denodo to implement this functionality. Now, encryption is something you probably know because as an everyday user of technology, you, of course, are using it every day. And that is basically turning data which would be otherwise clear text into an encrypted format that only somebody who is authorized and has a key can decrypt and see. There are different kinds of encryption. Denodo has extremely basic encryption functionalities. This, again, is something that we wouldn't necessarily try and do all by ourselves, but we do in a larger technological ecosystem. And finally, anonymization. Now, this is something I want to spend a little bit time explaining because it's a term that I see misused quite frequently. Anonymization is not just masking personal data, and I'll explain why. Now let's imagine I've built a database, and that database has information about the health and well-being of sales engineers all around the world at Denodo. And so you'll find, how many hours of sleep we get, how much exercise we get, how many cups of coffee we drink a day. And when I'm providing access to my database, I can be very careful and always masking the name and the first name and the last name and the email address, and all of that personal data can be masked. But the data is not necessarily anonymized, because let's imagine that you've masked name, first name, last name, email address, but you haven't masked whether somebody is which region they work in. For example, whether they work in EMEA or whether they work in North America. And you also haven't maybe masked, whether or not they're an American citizen. So if you're interested in this subject, I encourage you to read up on K-anonymity, L-diversity. These are interesting things you can learn more about on the internet. And I'm not a specialist, but just know that when a customer talks about anonymization, there are bigger subjects beyond just masking, which are hiding behind that.